Today's video will be taking a second look at my K6-3 Plus build.
We review all technology from games to all PCs, and don't forget the toys. Don't get Asian electronics. We cover it all.
Hey guys, thank you for joining me in this video. Today we're going to be looking at this machine again. This is my AMD K6-3 Plus PC. Now I did a full video on this PC several months ago. I went over all the details, but I think since then I've done enough changes to it, and I've kind of changed my philosophy on the use of this machine a little bit, enough to warrant doing like a follow-up update video. So if you're just watching this video, this is an update video. I strongly advise you to watch the original video I did on this machine. I'll make a link in the comments. If I remember, I'll have a little card in the corner. But in that video, I just kind of go over this whole machine in general, at least how I had it then. So I would advise watching that, because I'm not going to go over all the specifics here. Basically just going to go over what I've changed in this machine. So I have changed a few things. I've actually changed the CPU. It's still a K6-3 Plus, but you'll see something interesting. In the last few months, something has come up in the K6-3 Plus community, I suppose, that's changed things a little bit. So same CPU, but different CPU. You'll see. I've also changed the video and sound cards. So we'll go over these changes, and then we'll see this guy in action. Alright, so first things first, let's talk about the CPU upgrade that I've done. I also want to take special note here of the case badge. This is a special AMD K6-3 Plus badge. I believe my prior build I was using just a more kind of generic AMD K6-3, official but generic. This one's a little more specialized. Of course, you can pick up this badge and badges just like it from Geek and Spiel. He sells a lot of awesome badges and stickers for your PC case on eBay, so check them out. So let's talk about the CPU. Now, you might be thinking, the CPU? You already have a K6-3 Plus in there. Actually, one of the lower voltage ones, and it's already running at 550 megahertz. Well, I've never been able to push mine to 600 megahertz. For whatever reason, I could not get that CPU stable at 600 megahertz. So I just actually received this guy today. Now, if you're looking at that, you might be like, yeah, that's a K6-2 Plus. That's pretty much the same kind of CPU, except it has half of the L2 cache. And yeah, it's clocked a little bit higher. This one is officially rated for 570 megahertz, but that's really going to be a hit there with the half of the L2 cache. Okay, well, let me tell you about something I learned about very recently. First, this chip right here, the 570 megahertz K6-2 Plus, right now, as of May 2022, there is a ton of these on eBay. I don't know the story, but it seems like someone has a warehouse of these, and they're selling 3 of these for, it's under $100. So they're currently pretty available and pretty cheap. These also seem to be very like late model K6-2 Pluses, so these are brand new. They haven't had a lot of or any use at all, so they should be really good as far as that goes. So this is something I learned very recently. I don't know if it's just these later batches of K6-2 Pluses, but apparently these all have the full 256K of L2 cache on them. I don't understand the economics of it or why AMD did this, but apparently on these K6-2 Pluses, specifically these ones, they just disabled half of the cache to turn a K6-3 Plus into a K6-2 Plus. Again, maybe someone can enlighten me in the comments. I don't understand the economics of this. If they already have the full cache on the die and on the chip, why would you cut it down and sell it at a lesser price? I mean, maybe it makes some kind of economic sense. I'm not an economist, so maybe they actually make more money selling like half of the chips at a lower price. I don't know. My first thought is, well, maybe these are just the chips that had defective L2 cache, and then they found like if they disabled half of it, they worked fine. So hey, let's turn it into a K6-2 plus. But apparently, the bulk of these things, the full cache works just fine. Now, the mod apparently involves taking this off, the heat spreader off, and there's a component, and you desolder it, and you just move it over, and then solder it back on, and voila! That enables the full amount of cache, and it basically turns this brand new K6-2 Plus into a K6-3 Plus, so that's pretty cool. Now, I haven't done the mod on this. There was a guy offering these chips, and he did the mod, and he tested them at 600 megahertz, and he I don't know if he offers a guarantee, but he did tell me that this specific chip that he modded was tested at 600 megahertz, and it ran stable. So yeah, I know it's only a 50 megahertz bump, but I don't know, I just wanted to see that 600 megahertz at the post screen. Now I don't know on my machine if this is going to identify as a K6-3 Plus or still a K6-2 Plus. I've seen some instances where it still identifies as a K6-2 Plus, but I've also seen others where it identifies as a K6-3 Plus. I'm not sure. So this runs at 2 volts. I believe I'm going to have to bump the voltage up to like 2.1. And it should work fine on a 6 times multiplier with the same 100 megahertz front side bus. So I haven't tested this guy yet. So we're going to install it. And we'll see if we get that 600 megahertz. And just for note, I've also seen people mod these CPUs specifically, where they do the mod and then they have like jumpers on the side here, and you can actually change the jumpers and select like what type of CPU it ends up acting as. So you can change a jumper. It'll be like a K6-2 Plus, and then you do the mod with the jumpers, and you can move the jumper and it could be like a K6-2 and then a K6-3 Plus. I don't really have a use for that mod, but I have seen some people on YouTube actually do that with these K6-2 Plus CPUs. Just a refresher on the motherboard here. For this project, we are running a GA5AX motherboard. This is revision 5.2. I believe that is the latest revision of this board. It uses the Ali chipset, and I believe this is the newest revision of the chipset. It has the H designation right here. I remember reading on Vogans or something, if it has the H, there's something a little bit special about it, like it enables tag RAM or tag cache RAM or something like that. I don't remember the specifics. I just remember someone posting something about this last revision with the H. There may or may not be something special about it. Let me know in the comments if you know what I might be sort of vaguely recalling here. But overall, this is a great Super Socket 7 board. I have run the K6-3 Plus CPU in this board for a couple years now, and it's been flawless. I've had no issues with it. For RAM, we're just running 256 megabytes of SD RAM PC133. And then the hard drive I'm not running off the board. I'm actually running it off a controller card. I believe this is an ID ATA 133 controller card, I believe. And yeah, this board does have two 16-bit ISA slots as well as the PCI, of course the AGP slot. So now let's talk about the video card. Now, I got a lot of comments on the original video I did on this machine, and a lot of them had to do with the video card. So the original video card I used was the TNT2 Ultra. I guess the biggest reason is I just wanted to use something different than the Voodoo 3. I think the TNT2 Ultra is a very good contender for like one of the best Super Socket 7 CPUs. It's very good overall compatibility, even in DOS. I believe like it does the detail with textures a little bit better, and another thing it does, it can do 32-bit color, where the Voodoo 3 cannot do 32-bit color. But I did get quite a lot of comments on that video talking about, you know, a TNT2 or any card in a Super Socket 7 sort of PC is just not powerful enough to drive games running in 32-bit color. So it's kind of wasted. You're better off using a card that can do 16 or 24-bit color, because a Super Socket 7 board, even the K6-3 Plus, just doesn't have the horsepower to run these games with 32-bit color. And I mean, there's a fair argument to that. But one of the biggest reasons I decided to switch the CPU in this is, well, I actually found another TNT2 Ultra, and I put it in a different machine. I put it in my IBM desktop machine, and I actually like the TNT2 Ultra in that machine a little bit better. It runs a Pentium 3, so it does have the horsepower to run those Windows 98 games that can do 32-bit color a little bit better than my Super Socket 7 machine here. So seeing as I did that, I figured, well, I'll just throw in the Voodoo 3 in this build. So this is just a Voodoo 3 3000. This is not the 3500 that's running a little bit faster. Unfortunately, those have become very hard to find. I was even considering putting off this video until maybe I could find one, but I honestly don't think I will ever find one around here for a price I'm comfortable with. I actually do have a Voodoo 3500, and it's one of the weird ones that require like a weird like external adapter thing, but that's in my storage unit on the other side of the country, so obviously I don't have access to it right now. But considering this card has some beefed up cooling, I think what we might do is try overclocking this card to 183 megahertz. So I've heard you can overclock these Voodoo 3 3000s to Voodoo 3 3500 speeds if you're lucky. So we'll see. I didn't mention it yet, but I'll mention it now. This card obviously has been slightly modified. It has this nice Hawking fan on it. Standard heatsink. There's a couple guides on YouTube about, slapping a fan on these, because, they could really use them, especially if you're trying to get 3500 speeds, or if it's a 3500. But this one, I got this fan off like some random CPU heatsink, and it just happens to have these little grips here, and it just happens to go on this heatsink fine, and it's very solid. It's not going anywhere. And this is meant for like a CPU, so it's a pretty good fan. It covers the whole thing. Of course, it kind of covers like a little bit of the top here, but that's perfectly fine. So yeah, I think considering that we have this pretty big fan on there, I think we're going to try to overclock it. Now, I wish I could... Now, I know the back of these get a little warm. I've read some things where you can maybe stick like a heatsink on the back here. I don't really feel comfortable doing that, so I won't be doing that. Unfortunately, on this motherboard as well, there's not a slot like after the AGP card. So the Voodoo 3 is going to go here, and it's going to be right here. Some cases you'll have an extra one right here. That would have been good to put like a fan blowing on the back of the card. Unfortunately, there's no slot here for that, so we won't be doing that. But we'll try running it normally first, and then we'll overclock it, and then see how it runs. Alright, so let's talk about what's probably the most controversial change I've done to this machine, and that is the sound card. Previously I used a Yamaha 16-bit ISA sound card, and there were several reasons for that. It had a real OPL chip on it, and it just, when you're running that 16-bit ISA card for sound, it's just a lot more DOS compatible. And I kind of built this machine and touted it as a very fast DOS machine. So it was kind of like a tweener machine. You could play Windows 98, Windows 95, and even DOS titles with very high compatibility. That was one of my requirements when I was putting this machine together, is very high DOS game compatibility. But as I've used this computer over the years, I've found that I've used it for DOS very, very rarely. I pretty much exclusively use it for Windows 98 gaming. And that makes sense because, I have a bunch of actual DOS computers, so, why would I play a DOS game on this computer when I would just play it on my 486 or my early Pentium or something like that? And even if I wanted to play a DOS computer on like a really fast machine, I have my DOSzilla machines for that. So I just didn't find myself running DOS games on this machine. So that kind of what's prompted me to go from an ISA to a PCI sound card. There was also another reason, and that is a specific game I want to play on this machine, which is Final Fantasy VII. I've beaten the PlayStation version years ago, but I really wanted to play through it on the PC just to check it out. And so this is the card I've ended up choosing. So this is also a Yamaha sound card, although this one is, of course, PCI rather than ISA. And it uses the Yamaha XG chip here. Now this is kind of a overall maybe sort of cheap card. I've seen fancier versions of this card with like more connectors here and even like a digital out. There's fancier versions of sound cards that use this chip, and there's even later revisions of the chip that add certain things. But this is one of the earlier revisions, I think. This is a YMF724E-V. Now this card still, even though it is PCI, from what I've seen, still has a very high compatibility with DOS games, and it still does Yamaha OPL3 FM sound pretty well, and we're going to test that out a little bit. But the main reason I wanted it is because it does Yamaha's XG MIDI, which was their kind of version of MIDI. Like Roland had the sound canvas and Yamaha had their own. And I've always kind of preferred Yamaha. Ever since I heard the original Doom soundtrack playing with the Yamaha XG, like an external MIDI box, I was kind of hooked with the Yamaha MIDI sound. I really like it. Now this isn't as good as, say, if you had an actual Yamaha like external MIDI box, but it's pretty close. It's good enough. So I wanted to use this with Final Fantasy VII since it's kind of in hardware, whereas my previous card, the ISA card, it also did XG, but it was kind of through like software emulation. It didn't sound quite as good as, you know, the hardware solution. I usually prefer hardware solutions, but this is a pretty decent card. It has a lot of different connectors. I'm not sure what all of them are here. We have AC3 module here, video in, aux in, modem, and then these are probably for connecting to like CD drives, although it's odd it doesn't just say CD, it just says Con 1 and 2 and 3 there. This connector right here, I'm not 100% sure what it is, but it looks like it might be like a Sound Blaster, oh, I forget what you call it, like a Sound SB link cable. And that was on some PCI cards. If your motherboard had the same kind of Sound Blaster link connector, you could connect the PCI sound card to the motherboard via this special cable, and it increased your compatibility with DOS games. My motherboard unfortunately does not have that connector, so I can't utilize it here, but I'm okay with that. Like I said, I have found myself using this build very little with actual DOS games, so I think I will be happier with this card running Windows games, but we'll take a look at it. I believe it supports like direct sound and things like that. It should be just fine for Windows use. So like I said, we'll take a listen to it and we'll look at a couple games in Windows and DOS with this card. So before I put the cover on this, I just wanted to show you guys one weird kind of janky thing I've done to maybe help with cooling for the Voodoo 3 with the overclocking. Is I added this weird kind of fan that goes over top. I just kind of connected it here, like that's the same screw that's holding in the video card, and it doesn't quite go over the back exactly where I want it to, but I think it's pretty close. It should help with airflow a little bit. I am confident that this fan on the heatsink here should be sufficient, but I figure you can't have too much cooling. I did have to use another little adapter thing, like a Molex to a fan connector. This is a great motherboard, but it really is lacking in the fan connector department. I see that connector for the CPU fan, but I don't see any case fan connectors on this board. I don't know, maybe I'm missing them or something. I guess I could pull up the manual to double check, but yeah, I don't see like any fan connectors for case fans on here, just the CPU fan connector, but that's okay. I got little Molex to fan adapters, so hopefully this should help a little bit and not add too much noise. It's actually on there pretty well, so I don't think it's going anywhere either. So I did run into one issue with this CPU, and it's actually the multiplier. Now if you look here on this little chart here, there actually is a setting for ×6. but whenever I set this to times 6, I get times 2 on the CPU. So I don't know if that is like some kind of weird thing with the modification or what, but I cannot get the times 6 multiplier. Now I actually did talk to people that have used this modified K6-3 Plus on the same board with the same revision, and they don't have any trouble. It seems to work for them. So I don't know why it's just not working for me. Thankfully though, I did find a software solution around this problem. So the program I found is called SetMule, probably shorthand for Set Multiplier, and I downloaded it and I plopped it in on the C drive, as you can see there. The one thing is it doesn't work if I try to run it from Windows, so you just have to go into like the DOS prompt and run it from there. And it's pretty simple. It's pretty easy to set the multiplier. You just go to where it's located, you put set mule and then like 6.0 or 6 to set the multiplier. You also have options to disable and enable cache. I haven't messed with any of those. Don't really plan to. The other thing is you can even set this up in the auto exec bat, which I have done now, and it automatically on booting up the machine, it will set my multiplier to 6 times. So it will be running it at 600 megahertz. So yeah, you can see here, once you're in there, you just type in the command setmule 6 or setmule 6.0, and it will set your multiplier. And it's also easy to, downclock it using this program as well. And I just want to go into Everest here just to double check and make sure it indeed is running at 600 megahertz. And we can check out the CPU, and there we go, K6-3 Plus, 600 megahertz, 6 times 100 front side bus. So everything looks like it checks out here. And just to double check, looking in SysSoft Sander 99, we double check, and this program also is indeed detecting the processor as a K6-3. And here it says running at 602 megahertz, but close enough. Alright, it's time for everyone's favorite, the bar charts. Okay, so just keep in mind, I ran all these 3 times and took an average. There's not a ton I did here because this, whether you realize or not, this is a lot of benchmarking. It takes a lot of time, and like I see these stupid benchmarks at this point like in my dreams, or more like in my nightmares. So just keep that in mind. Our sample size is a little bit small because it takes a long time to do these benchmarks. So right here we have the K6-3 Plus at 550 megahertz as I previously had it, and now with the 50 megahertz bump with this new modded CPU. K6-3 Plus at 600 megahertz, and we see on these synthetic benchmarks we do see a little difference here. It's not a big amount, but I mean we weren't expecting much with just a 50 megahertz bump, but it is noticeable here. So let's move on to something a little bit more interesting. We're going to take a look at 2 games benchmarks. We're going to look at AMD K2 and Expendable. Again, I know it's a very small sample size of games, but like I said, it's just time constraints, and like, man, doing these benchmarks is very time consuming. So I only have 2 games to compare here, so let's take a look at that chart. And taking a look at these game benchmarks, again, not a big difference here. I don't think anyone would actually notice this in gameplay. Really the difference is 1 or 2 FPS that the 600 pulls above the 550, so not really noticeable, but then again, it may vary on games. This is only 2 games here that we're testing with, but very small difference, but a difference indeed. So I wanted to take this opportunity to quickly address an issue that has come up for me when running the Expendable benchmark. And I have noticed, for me, maybe 1 in 5, 1 in 6 times I run this benchmark. As you can see here, the benchmark goes off script. I'm not sure what's happening, but it completely kind of goes off script. The character, it feels like it's still doing its like scripted movements, but it's not where it's supposed to be. I initially thought that maybe this was like a timing issue with like a faster CPU, but this is on a Super Socket 7 machine. I've had this happen on like a fast Pentium 4, and like I said, even these slower Super Socket 7 builds. So I don't think it's a speed issue. I know Phil from Phil's Computer Lab is pretty fond of this game and this benchmark, and I asked him if he had ever run across this issue where the benchmark goes off script, and he said it has never happened to him, and I know he's run this benchmark a lot, so I don't know why it happens to me. I don't know. I just thought it'd be interesting if I brought this up and showed you guys here, because I was able to capture it for once, but yeah, I don't know why it does this to me sometimes. Maybe it's just my version of the game. I'm just using the retail version off the CD. So I don't know. It just does it sometimes. I should also say, obviously, I do not use the benchmark results from these flawed runs. And hey, look, despite everything else seemingly to detect this CPU as a K6-3+, 3D Mark 2000 sees it as a K6-2+ still. Alright, so now let's see if we can overclock the Voodoo 3 to Voodoo 3500 speeds. I'm using the official Voodoo overclock tool here. So we're going to go from 166 megahertz all the way up to 183 and cross our fingers and hope for the best. And after a restart, our Voodoo 3 is indeed running at a Voodoo 3500 speed. So let's run those benchmarks again and see if there's any difference. And as you can see with our synthetic benchmarks, bumping the speed to the Voodoo card up to 3500 levels made very little difference. It did make a difference here with these numbers, but it's very small. It seems like bumping the CPU 50 megahertz, at least in the instance of these synthetic benchmarks, did more good than bumping up the graphics card speeds. Now, I'm not going to show a chart for the two games, but because the numbers were pretty much the same. They maybe went up like fractions of an FPS. You know what I think we're just seeing a bottleneck here with the CPU. You might see different results, you know, with the games that maybe, you know, focus on demanding on the GPU a little bit more, but I think it's a CPU bottleneck with this Voodoo 3. The Voodoo 3 is a pretty powerful graphics card, but it just seems in this system you're just not really seeing much of a benefit when you bump up the Voodoo 3 speed. Again, two games, super small sample size, so I mean, I guess if you want, you could call it inconclusive because of the small sample size, but it is what it is. Alright, so let's look at this machine, the CPU, and this sound card in action here and take a look at some games. I just want to show you real quick, this is the software that came with that Yamaha sound card. A lot of different options in here. There's an option for SPDIF. Of course, my card doesn't have that kind of output on it, but different options. Pretty decent software here. Here you can see everything. There's an option for the MP401 out, and I have it set for XG. I believe Serial will enable the serial port if you wanted to use an external MIDI box, but I have it set for the internal XG MIDI on there. So let's take a look at a couple games here running at the 600 megahertz K6-3+ and with this Yamaha card. So the first game we're going to look at here is Demon Star. It's kind of like a primitive feeling shooter game. This actually came bundled with the drivers for this Yamaha sound card. I guess this game like directly supports this sound card, although it is kind of a poor choice of games to show off your sound card because it really doesn't seem to take advantage of this sound card at all. It's just not very impressive. The sound is not very impressive, and it's not really a very impressive game either. It almost seems like a Flash game, kind of. I mean, I guess you shouldn't expect too much with a sound card pack-in, but you'd at least think it would have like really good like MIDI sound or something to take advantage of the card, but it just does not. And if you're still hungry for a little bit more benchmarks, let's take a look at GL Quake on this setup and see how well it does. let's take a quick listen to the MIDI for Final Fantasy VII. After all, this game was kind of the inspiration for me putting in this specific Yamaha sound card. So let's see how it sounds. And now let's take a look at just a few Windows games running on this CPU and this setup in general and the sound card. And we'll start out here with Doom for Windows 95, and then we'll take a look at a couple other games, and then after that we'll take a look at some DOS games just to see how this sound card works with a couple different DOS games. And this here was the one error I actually got throughout all of my testing running the CPU at 600 megahertz. I'm not sure what caused it, but other than this, the system was stable throughout.
For the lead. You are tied for the lead. You are tied. Excellent. Excellent. Excellent.
Fly close to it, boys, and see if you can see anything. There might be something else good down there.
Those carvings, the beginning of a cave. Say, there's an old ostrich out there. That guy has a few secrets. Golden secrets.
Attention, unidentified aircraft. This area is under British authority.
Kiss that bridge goodbye.
Sure.
Confirm you landed at 12 o'clock. Shoot, I bet
Alright, so let's take a look at a couple DOS games, see how the sound card works in DOS. And when you go into DOS, you can run this kind of configuration utility if you need to, configure things for your sound card in DOS. So this is Eye of the Beholder 2, and it's using the FM sound version. I'm pretty sure this game does have a like a MIDI soundtrack, but it just defaulted to the FM. I didn't even see any option to use like MIDI. I did download this from my CD from the TSR Silver Collection, so maybe it's not an option on that version. But I could have swore this had a MIDI soundtrack. But anyways, I couldn't get it to run sound with anything but the FM. This is a problem you'll see again in a moment.
Intruder! Medic!
You're dead. You're dead.
Unfortunately, under DOS, I couldn't get the MIDI to work with any games, and I even had a couple games like Lemmings where I couldn't get the FM to work. Although in general, I could get the FM sound to work. I actually couldn't get Duke Nukem 3D to work at all. It would, if I would select any kind of MIDI for the music card, whether it be general MIDI or sound canvas, I would hear nothing. and even FM was sketchy. It would work for a minute, and then it would tell me the next time I would try it that the FM's not detected. And whenever I would try to run the game, I would get issues. I couldn't run it; it would crash because of like sound card not found problems. Now I know this card works with this game because High Treason, another YouTuber, he's the only one I know of that does a video that takes any kind of look at this this sound chip, and he had this game working fine. He said, you know, if you set it up correctly, it works fine, and it worked for him. It didn't work for me for whatever reason. I've also noted that he does seem to really like this card, or at least not this card specifically, but this Yamaha sound chip. And in his opinion, he did say that he thinks it does the FM very well. So I don't know. What do you guys think? So far, overall, I really like this sound card and CPU. The CPU, this modded K6-2 Plus seems, you know, very stable so far. I had one issue with Unreal, but I don't know if that had anything to do with the CPU. It could have been a number of other issues. So far, it's been rock solid in all of my testing and running all these benchmarks for hours. No problems except for, as I said, Unreal. I like the sound card as well. I think it sounds really good, and I really like it in Windows. Again, it's not perfect in DOS, and as I said, High Treason's been able to get it to work in games that I couldn't, but it probably just takes a little bit of like setting up and a little bit more effort on my part. That's fine. Like I said, I've kind of changed the focus for this machine. It's really more focused on Windows and not DOS. And in that sense, the sound card is just fine for me. I don't think it does anything fancy like EAX or, you know, Oriole sound, what is it? S3D, not S3D. Geez, it escapes me, like A3D. I don't think it does any like fancy sound things like that, but it's pretty capable for Windows 98.
So, before I wrap this video up, I wanted to do one more thing, and I wanted to test a little overclocking, because this chip seems to overclock a lot better than an actual K6-3 Plus, or at least the ones I've had. So, so far we've been just running it with the ×6 multiplier, and it's been running on the standard 100 megahertz frontside bus. So, if you look here, this board has settings for a much higher frontside bus, all the way up to 140 megahertz frontside bus. Now, I'm guessing that would be really unstable if it even worked at all. Also, the other thing is, a lot of times if you want to use a higher frontside bus with these K6-3s or modded K6-2 Pluses, you want to start disabling cache. And I've actually heard disabling a lot of the cache, maybe not all of it, but like the L3 cache, and using like a higher frontside bus and multiplier, you actually will get possibly better results and performance than if you even had the L3 cache going. I don't want to do that though. I kind of want to test this without disabling any cache, so keep that in mind. Now, I have tested this in the past with the ×6 multiplier and the 105 megahertz frontside bus, and I think it did work. It did post, but I didn't do any like stress testing or benchmarking or anything. I think maybe I want to go kind of big. I've heard people that were able to run these at 120 megahertz frontside bus, and then we tuned down the multiplier. We still want to get 600 megahertz. So I might want to try that. Just to see what the difference is. I don't know. I think it's going to be unstable. It does throw the AGP bus out of spec right there. It actually tells you, if it would focus on this board, what the AGP bus ends up running at. So right now we're at 66 megahertz. That's it within spec. It would be running at 80 if we were using 120 megahertz frontside bus. I don't know. I guess we'll see. We'll see.
And unfortunately, even though my machine would post, it would attempt to boot into Windows, but every time it would start loading Windows, it would have some kind of issue and it would lock up. Now, yeah, I could play around with things a little bit more, mess around with the voltage and stuff, but I don't want to do that. So instead I'm going to dial it back. And I think we're going to run it at 110 megahertz front-side bus with a 5.5 multiplier. That should give us 605 megahertz. If that does okay, we're going to bump it up again, and we're going to try 115 megahertz front-side bus at 5.5, and that will give us 633 megahertz. That sounds like a real 605 megahertz. Doesn't sound like a chip that would have been like officially released, but 633 does. So let's see what happens. All right, so with our 110 megahertz front-side bus overclock, the machine actually does post. And then let's take a look here just to confirm it. And yeah, everything looks like it should with our overclock here. So let's take a look at some benchmarks. Let's run some of those benchmarks again, and then let's compare it with our non-front side bus overclocked setup. And there you go. If you wanted to compare our synthetic benchmarks here with our 110 megahertz front side bus overclocked system, there's definitely a difference, and what you see playing their video footage is from the front side bus overclock. Yeah, it was perfectly 100% stable. I had no issues running any of these benchmarks. I ran at this overclock for hours, multiple benchmarks, multiple times. No locking up, glitches, anything. It seemed to work just fine. You know, just for fun, also, I do want to say that I did go back into SetMule, and I set the multiplier to ×6 just to see what would happen for a it was a CPU megahertz speed of 660 megahertz, and it actually did keep running for a few minutes, and I started running 3D Mark 99 Max, and it did lock up going through that first benchmark with like the little, I don't know, the little racers. It did lock up there, but I just wanted to see what would happen for fun. Alright, so let's kick it up a notch, and let's see our results if we bump things up to 115 megahertz front-side bus, and we have the 633 megahertz K6-3 Plus. Let's see how it performs. And at 115 megahertz front-side bus overclock, it does seem to post. We've got 633 megahertz there for the CPU, and it did go into Windows fine, and I was able to run some benchmarks, so let's take a look at those results. So we do see an increase in performance, as you can see here. Unfortunately, though, this is where we did start to see some instability. Unfortunately, with 3D Mark 2001 SE, it just would not run with this overclock for some reason. I tried multiple times and it crashed at the beginning every time. Not at the exact same spot, but really generally near the beginning of the benchmark it would crash. All the other benchmarks, though, including the games, ran fine. I think I had one lock up at one point. I believe it was 3D Mark 2000. Did freeze up once during like the helicopter test, but other than that, it ran multiple other times, at least 3 other times, plus all the other benchmarks and games ran fine without issues. So I would say it's mostly stable with the front side bus at this speed. Again, we could probably do some tinkering and get a little more stable, but for the scope of this video, that's about as far as I would go. Now, I didn't do charts for the front side bus overclocks for the games. That's because the performance differences weren't that much. They maybe gained a couple FPS, but I'll just tell you right here, for our 110 front side bus overclock, we got 36 FPS for Expendable and 42 for AMD K6-2. And for our big 115 front side bus overclock, for Expendable we got 38 FPS, and we got 44 for MDK2. So, you know, we got a difference there, and it's definitely noticeable between, you know, K6-3 plus 550 megahertz and then the 633 with the overclocked front side bus. But, yeah, in between, I mean, it's just a small incremental speed increase in between all these. But, yeah, I'm pretty impressed with the how stable it was with those front side bus overclocks. So, all right, let's wrap things up. So yeah, how about that? I'm actually pretty pleased with the performance of this CPU, the modded K6-2 Plus. It actually performed much better than my actual K6-3 Plus. Now, all these CPUs are a little bit different, so maybe mine is a good performer. I don't know. Maybe it's actually a bad performer compared to some of the other ones out there. I don't know. But remember, there are little differences between them. You might get one of these that's modded, and it might not be able to do much past 600 megahertz. It may do better than mine. I didn't push mine too much. Like I said, I didn't do things like disable the the L2 cache on the CPU. I didn't up the voltage more or too much. I just didn't want to stress things too much. And I didn't want to drag out this video too much. So I wanted to keep it kind of simple. And you might have a K6-3 Plus that's just performed a lot better than mine. I just know that the one I had couldn't break like 550 megahertz without issues, and this guy has been just stellar for me. I'm not going to keep things overclocked too much. I think I'm just going to keep my machine at a nice 600 megahertz with that 100 megahertz front side bus. But it was fun to experiment a little bit. So what do you guys think about my build? Like I said, I moved away a little bit from DOS. I went more with like a Windows kind of build. What do you think? Do you like my changes or not? What do you think about these modded K6-2 Pluses? I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.